Welcome back to another explainer. Today, we're zooming in on the mythological origins of humanity, the story of us, in J.R.R. Tolkien's universe. The text we're digging into today focuses specifically on the chapter titled Of Men, and it is just a fascinating foundational look at exactly where we fit into the ancient, massive tapestry of Middle-earth, and honestly, what makes our journey so uniquely tragic and beautiful. Okay, let's dive into this because it's the ultimate existential mystery at the very heart of the legendarium, right? Why do humans die while elves live forever? This isn't just some random biological quirk. It is the absolute philosophical core that defines the entire trajectory of Middle-earth and the deeply complex relationship between its two greatest peoples.
So let's start at the beginning, the awakening of men, right around the second spring of Arda.
Picture this. The very first sun rises, and suddenly the air of Middle-earth becomes heavy with mortality. That's when the chronological journey of early humanity actually kicks off. We woke way, way out in the east, in a land called Hilderian. And because that very first sun arose in the west, our ancestors' opening eyes instinctively turned toward it, and they naturally just started straying westward across the earth. As they wandered, they befriended the Dark Elves. But unfortunately, that westward wandering ultimately led them directly into the crosshairs of the Great Wars. Before we get too far, let's establish some of the essential terminology given to us by the Eldar. The first major one is Atani, which simply means the second people, because obviously the elves were here first. The other key term you'll see is Hildor, which translates to the followers. Both of these names really firmly place humanity in our cosmic role. We are the younger siblings who arrived super late to the party.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is, well, not all the names we were given were quite so neutral. There's a huge variety, and honestly, a lot of hostility in some of the other titles elves threw our way. The usurpers, the night-fearers, the sickly, the inscrutable, the self-cursed. I mean, just reading those aloud, you can practically feel the intense, immediate friction between our fragile, fast-burning ancestors and the immortal, ethereal beings they were suddenly bumping into. Which brings us to the next massive hurdle for humanity, strangers to the Valar, and our deep spiritual isolation. Unlike the elves who were actively sought out and guided by the angelic guardians of the world, our ancestors were basically completely isolated in Hildorian. No Vala came down in person to guide us or summon us to paradise. This is perfectly captured in the text right here. Men have feared the Valar rather than loved them, and have not understood the purposes of the powers. Now, it's not that the Valar entirely ignored us. Actually, the Vala Ulmo would often send messages through streams and floods. Men absolutely loved the waters, and their hearts were stirred by it. But we completely lacked the skill to actually decipher what the waters were trying to tell us. So, lacking that direct divine guidance, men instead became the companions and disciples of ancient dark elves. These were the elven wanderers who had never made that great journey to Valinor. That means literally everything men learned during their childhood as a species came from these earthly, non-enlightened elves. To early humanity, the Valar were nothing more than a distant rumor and a faraway name. All right, let's get into the real crux of Men, immortality versus mortality, the core divide. And this brilliantly illustrates just how massive the physical and spiritual gap between the two kindreds really is. This contrast shapes literally everything that happens in the subsequent ages. Think about the elves. They are immortal. Their wisdom constantly expands across ages, and they are completely immune to sickness or pestilence. Sure, their bodies are eventually consumed from within by the sheer fire of their spirit, but they don't naturally die. Then consider men. We are frail, subject to basically every illness imaginable, easily slain by a weapon or just plain bad luck, and we grow old and die. But, and I love this detail, it wasn't always this dynamic of extreme physical inequality. Way back at the dawn of years, elves and men were actually of completely equal stature and strength of body. We were physical equals. That said, the text does make it very clear that the elves possessed significantly greater wisdom, skill, and beauty right from the jump. But the greatest disparity in their fates is beautifully, almost hauntingly summed up in this quote, "What may befall their spirits after death, the elves know not." There is such a deep reverence in this mystery. Out of all the great powers in the universe, only Mandos and Manwë, under Iluvatar himself, know where men actually go when we die. Even the absolute wisest immortal elves are totally in the dark about our ultimate destination. So, the crucial point is this. The fate of men after death is not in the hands of the Valar, nor was it ever foretold in the music of the Ainur. Just let that sink in for a second. Humanity's ultimate destiny is completely off script. It is unwritten, unsung in the great creation song, and exists entirely outside the control of the governing powers of the world. We are the ultimate wild card. And that wild card status leads us directly into our next section, the rise of shadows and the forces of ruin. From those mysterious independent origins we just talked about, humanity quickly entered a much darker chapter. As men spread across the world, their early joy was incredibly brief. The text compares it to the joy of the morning before the dew is even dry. That fleeting dawn gave way to devastating conflict, largely driven by the cunning lies that Morgoth constantly planted among his enemies. Add in the lingering curse of the tragic slaying at Aqualande and the absolute devastation of the Oath of Fëanor. All these forces were constantly at work, dragging both elves and mortal men together into the ruinous meat-grinder wars of the North against Morgoth. Which brings us to the tragic aftermath, the fading of the elves and a permanent estrangement. Following the horrific ruin of those great wars and Morgoth's ultimate triumph, the dynamic of the world fundamentally shifted forever. It led to this incredibly tragic estrangement between our two peoples, and it leads to what I think is one of the most striking lines in the entire text. Read it with me. Men usurped as sunlight. Man, that really hits hard, doesn't it? As the immortal elves began to wane and fade from the world, it was fragile, short-lived humanity that ended up inheriting the earth, claiming the daylight entirely for themselves. Let's move to and see how this builds, because the visual here is so melancholic. As men claimed to the sun, the Quendi, the elves, just wandered off into the lonely places of the great lands and the isles. They took to the moonlight and the starlight, retreating into the deep woods and caves, becoming, as Tolkien beautifully puts it, as shadows and memories. Yet we absolutely shouldn't forget how it all started. Back in the dawn of years, elves and men were true allies. They viewed each other as kin. Some men learned the incredible wisdom of the Eldar and became valiant captains. They even shared in the glory and beauty of offspring, producing these legendary figures of both elven and mortal blood, people like Arendil, Elwing, and Elrond. They were deeply, profoundly united before the fading began. Which leaves us with this final, massive question to ponder. Is the mortality of men, our short, frail, fleeting existence that is completely unwritten in the music of the universe, is it a curse or is it actually a gift? It remains the ultimate unresolved mystery of our mythic origins. Definitely something to think about the next time you look up at the stars. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.